The French army before World War I is rather well known for being historically underprepared for the ensuing conflict. From the red trousers to the lack of proper headgear to the lack of proper artillery and just a inadequate supply of shells for the war, France was seen as sort of a joke to military historians in 1914. And their only bright spot was really 1916 during the conflict that many people will look at. However, this stereotypically inadequate army was the first to adopt the steel helmet during the war and changed the look of modern warfare forever with the advent of the M15 Adrian helmet. How was this? To keep up with the theme of talking about the French military during World War I, which seems to be popular for me right now for some reason, I'm going to be talking about the M15 Adrian helmet that I have in my collection and explain some of the nice little nuances and quirks about this piece, as well as our misunderstanding of the French military situation leading up to World War I and why we seem to treat them a little bit harshly. I'm the Wolf of 1918, and welcome to a brand new series for my channel where I take a look at pieces in my collection, explain their background, and try to break down the history of that particular piece based on what I can figure out from looking at it. As we all know, the French military is stereotypically bad. This isn't to say that that's what they are historically, but there's a lot of jokes about their inadequacies. Why is this? Well, it's a two-layered question, really. There isn't much substance to why this is. Mainly, it comes from World War II. Their early surrender in the war, even though it was very, very understandable what happened when you actually take a more than surface-level look into it, was seen as cowardly to the British, and a lot of their propaganda made it seem that way, along with the German propaganda, and that changed our outlook on how we viewed the war later on, the historiography. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I'm kind of stupid. So that formulated how we looked at the French military as years went on, as well as some of the conflicts in Africa that didn't really go the French way, and they just kind of didn't feel like fighting for colonial possessions that were outdated and needed to be released anyway. It really changed the outlook on the French military to the modern people, i.e. us. On top of that, there are a plethora of memes making fun of the French uniforms on the outbreak of the war, from the red pantaloons to the lack of any real equipment. You know, their artillery pieces were all direct fire, which, if you know anything about World War I, that's not at all how it worked. You needed indirect fire weapons because you rarely ever saw what you were shooting at. So the French army wasn't very well prepared. And there's a reason for it that is very understandable, and when you start to see why, you kind of almost feel bad for the timing, and you wonder how the French army survived at all, and it almost becomes a statement for their power as to how they ended up going forward and winning the war. It's very interesting to be talking about this wearing a German World War I tunic, but I'm going to be doing that anyway. So let's discuss, first of all, the M15 Adrian that is right here, which I'm sure a lot of people might be interested to learn about. So this particular piece right here has a later war paint job on it, and as far as I can tell, it might actually be even post-war. I'm not too sure. It's a dark blue color that is in stark contrast to the blue-gray horizon blue that is so commonly seen on World War I M15 Adrians. Now, this is an M15 Adrian. You can tell by the mark right here along the brim, which connects the actual shield, which was for stopping shrapnel, from the actual upper part of the helmet, which was also to help against shrapnel and shockwaves. This particular helmet actually has a Type 1 liner, which was the first liner issued for M15 Adrian helmets, which means that this is one of the first Adrians ever produced by the French military. And it's very interesting. As you can see, it's falling apart. But it was made using old greatcoats that were so torn up they couldn't really be used anymore or were simply outdated. They used those to sort of add to more of a comfort so that it wouldn't be so hard on your head, and then they were lined with leather and put in with a metal frame around it. inside the metal helmet. This is falling apart so bad that I actually have paper clips trying to hold it into place so that it stops falling apart on me. What's interesting about this piece is it actually has the soldier's name written on the front brill, and there's a lot of different markings around the helmet. Most of it is in the same handwriting, so I can only guess that this was written by the same soldier. Now, there are a couple other writings that are a bit inconsistent, but it's very difficult to tell what they're from. So I'm having a bit of difficulty trying to identify what exactly was the history of this helmet. All the writing has the same exact type of wear and tear as the other writing and the other patches on the helmet of rust. So it almost seems like they were written around the same time as when this helmet was starting to deteriorate. There's also several dents in the helmet. Some of them look more recent than others, whereas the others are very obviously very old dents that probably were from the war. I'm not too sure, though. I don't really like saying for sure that various damage on items was because of use in the war, but for this specific helmet, based on the age of it and the fact that not only does it have an M1 liner, which was the first type of liner used for Adrian helmets, and a later war paint job on it, which means that this helmet was more than likely repainted. This helmet probably saw a lot of use before it finally found its way into America and somehow into my hands. So there's no doubt that much of this damage was caused by very, very hardy use. There's a lot of dents and scratches and warping on this helmet that you just don't really see on pieces that were late war production or never really used, which is very cool to know, and just to realize that someone more than likely, in fact, I'd say almost with 100% certainty, wore this into battle, which is fascinating to think about. And also just a little bit, awe-inspiring might be a proper word. I'm drawing a blank on it, but definitely shows that there's a level of respect that needs to be shown for these pieces. Because with a piece like this, that's obviously having been worn in combat, it does deserve a bit more respect than other pieces that might have just been a surplus item or something that was worn by a troop that never went into combat. This item was relied on by a soldier to keep him safe, and as such, it should be treated with the utmost amount of respect. Now, why was it that the French, of all nations, based on their reputation, were the first ones to create an effective piece of headwear to stop shrapnel from affecting soldiers? This has an add-on question, which is, why were the Germans one of the last nations to do this, of the great powers? Last of the competent nations, anyway. And that I will be discussing later when I talk about my Stahlhelm. So let's just discuss the reasons why the French army seems so inadequate when you look at their army in 1914 versus their army in late 1915. The French army was historically underfunded and overestimated their ability to fight a conflict in terms of what it would look like in a European war. See, the French military assumed that no matter what happened, they'd always have British support and they would always have Russian support. Their assumptions were also that the British would have more soldiers than they actually had in World War I, and that Russia would be quite a bit more competent at actually fighting against Germany and Austria. Their whole assumption was that Germany and Austria would focus on Russia, allowing France to basically take the defensive. And that's what they based their army around. They assumed that Russia would be the first to attack and that Germany and Austria would be so focused there that all France had to do was take a defensive stance. And this was the thought process for a very, very long time, ever since France really gained their alliance with Russia. And that started to change. So Russia basically wanted to see more offensive action from France in terms of the idea that a war would break out between their triple entente and the triple alliance of Italy, Austria, and Germany. None of these nations actually took into account the idea of Italy joining in. Germany and Austria were hopeful in the case of a war that Italy would join, but Italy was sort of this wild card. No one knew it would happen. So Russia was like, hey, France, how about you actually go on the offensive if war breaks out? Because we don't know how long it's going to take us to actually mobilize our forces. And this was mostly after the Russo-Japanese War, in which Russian forces were soundly defeated by what they assumed to be inferior Japanese forces. The first time a major European nation or major Western nation was defeated by a non-Western power that was more or less a inferior nation to the European eyes. So this immediately put Russia on the spot for this whole idea of, oh crap, we may not be able to actually go one-on-one with Germany, let alone one-on-two with Germany and Austria, even though Austria was more of a hindrance to Germany, but that's a whole other story. So they basically went to France and said, redo your plan, because we're going to need more time, and we may not be able to actually take on the offensive. So you need to go on the offensive as well, so that we can really just spread out their forces. In order to properly accommodate this, Joseph Joffrey was put into power as the military head to sort of plan around and sort of develop a new strategy. At this time, there was also discussions on updating the French uniform and the French equipment. There was this whole discussion on like, hey, we need better camouflage. Yeah, I know. And they said, let's replace the red pants with just the horizon blue to make it at least somewhat more camouflaged. We don't want red in the uniform. And there was a very famous statement by someone whose name I forget, where he basically said the red pants are French. The red pantaloons are French. They are the symbolism of France. Like, our uniform is what symbolizes us, and we cannot get rid of them. Just very stubborn. And they were at an impasse. They couldn't make a decision, so they just kept the uniforms as they were. Now, here's where things really start to look bad for the French, because they're trying to take these steps, and they had started taking these steps ever since the military plans had sort of changed from defensive doctrine to offensive doctrine in 1908, a mere 6 years before the war would start. Shifting your military doctrine, your entire idea of what you think the military should be used for in this case of war, from defensive to offensive to completely different military doctrines, in the span of 6 years is nigh impossible to do. You have to shift your industry, you have to shift your training. On top of that, the French military was already underfunded and in complete disarray. The soldiers were just not very well disciplined. So Joseph Joffrey took on the immense task of retraining the troops, getting better organization, and getting better discipline in the men, and training them for a new plan. I think it was Plan 9 or Plan 14. I forget the exact number because I'm not using a script. Forgive me. While dealing with all the infighting of people trying to get new supplies for the army to modernize them and match Germany, Britain, and Russia, and Austria of all nations, in order to match their stockpiling of shells, their use of artillery, and what exactly they were looking at to actually go forward with if there was a European war. What ended up happening was that as Joseph Joffrey is putting these things into place, in January of 1914, yes, very, very close to the start of the war, he is literally just getting the first phase of training finished as the war breaks out. So they are in this huge chaotic shift of doctrine, this changing of the guard, as you might say, from the old French military doctrine that they knew was outdated into this new military doctrine that could easily match Germany, Italy, or Britain's military doctrine. And they were literally in the opening stages of it when war breaks out. So of course they're going to suck. But because they were in the stage of looking at how are we going to fight wars better, they had all of these new people involved that were looking at better ways of waging war and had very innovative ideas rather than the old military personnel of Germany, Russia, Britain, Austria, Italy, the Ottomans, Bulgaria, Greece, etc., etc., etc. And so they were more willing to look at new ideas rather than rejecting them and trying to stick to the old ways, as you might see with the German officers, the British officers, the Russian officers, and so on and so forth. This, in fact, allowed the French to be more open to new strategies, new tactics, which allowed them to develop artillery tactics easier, and allowed them to be more willing to experiment with new things, especially due to the fact that they were fighting on their own land and were desperate to kick the Germans off. So you couple all of this together, and you have a French military that is more readily able to recognize the problem that the soldiers were facing with shrapnel wounds to the head, and the obvious remedy of a steel helmet. In fact, before they even developed the M15 Adrian, as early as late 1914, they were telling soldiers to put a custom-made metal plate inside their cap that they would normally wear to try and protect themselves from shrapnel damage. And this did some help, but it wasn't perfect. And so they were like, okay, let's shift gears and go for something else. Let's replace the hat, use that for like a dress uniform, and we'll use the Adrian as the protection unit. Now, they did have some issues with the paint. They realized it was too reflective, so they issued covers for these things, sort of like what you might see with the very rare and very rarely ever seen or pictured Stahlhelm covers. They had a canvas cloth brown cover for the Adrian helmets to cover the horizon blue paint. Makes you wonder why they didn't just paint them that way to begin with, but armies are going to army, and they're going to make mistakes and just refuse to change them. This was quickly reversed when they realized that anything that actually got through the helmet would create a worse wound, because then the dirty cloth cover would cause an infection in the skull, which was almost always fatal. So they literally ordered the troops, discard them, do not use them. If you use them, you will be punished. And then they just switched gears again and repainted them sometime in late 1916, early 1917 to this color, as far as I've been able to tell. It's kind of difficult to figure out things like that with nations that aren't Britain or America, but as far as I've been able to tell, they switched to this color in 1916, 1917, which is very interesting to see, as this is also the color that was taken on by the French National Guard type of thing, their equivalent to it, and is still used today in some aspect. A different shade of it is still used today on their helmets. Very interesting stuff. But yeah, very interesting helmet, probably one of the most produced helmets in military history and most widely exported helmets in military history. It was pretty nice because you could change out the emblem. The French had several emblems. They had the flaming grenade for infantry and whatnot for the standard. They had crossed cannons for artillery. They had a horn for different types of cavalry. So it was a very versatile helmet. You could easily identify what part of the army the person was from just based on the front of the helmet, which sometimes was a hindrance, as suddenly now the enemy knows what part of the army they are. But hey, the French are all about that style. And I will say that the French uniforms look the best out of all of the armies in the war. And it is just an interesting looking helmet. It has a very unique design that you just don't see in very many helmets. The Brodie helmet is a almost direct copy of the old medieval kettle helmets. The Stahlhelm is very similar to the medieval knight's helmets. This is just a unique design that is close to some medieval era helmets, but has its own unique flavor to it. And I really like the look of the Adrian. They're cool helmets. Or that effectively is just the situation of the French army in the early war, and how our historiography kind of treats the French army a little unfairly in terms of how it really was for them. And hopefully this video might have taught you something that you didn't know, or maybe you're just sitting there like, yeah, whatever. And I hope that you enjoyed at least getting a nice little view of the French Adrian helmet in my collection, and that this video was entertaining as always. If this is your first video of mine that you've seen and you want to stay involved in the community, or you just kind of want to stick around, there's a bunch of links in the description that you can use to get access to my Instagram account, to my Twitch, to my Discord, etc., etc. They're all down below if you want to stay connected. If you really enjoyed the video, you can like, comment, subscribe. It does help the YouTube algorithm, so it's always appreciated. Also, as you might see, this cup right here is my Wolf of 1918 official mug that I use for coffee every once in a while. They're pretty nice. If you are interested in getting one, which, they are available, there is a Teespring shop, and I think I have a promo code still active, which will be flashing on the screen now. I'm a very forgetful person, so I am doing a lot of quick fire videos. This is going to be one of many that I record today, and I'll be releasing them in spurts just to sort of keep the YouTube channel active as I get into a busy section of my life. So I do appreciate all the support, and I hope that this video was educational and entertaining as always.